Guys, so we're about to start a unit called trigonometry, which is actually my favorite part of geometry, or any of the maths for that matter. This is some pretty neat stuff, and that's what we're talking about today. So what I'd like to do is first ask the question, have you ever looked at your calculator and wondered what these buttons are right here in the middle? It looks like SIN, COS, TAN. A lot of people say sin, cos, tan, and you don't know what they are. You might have even seen them on the SAT or PSAT and not known what they are. But these are actually very useful tools for helping you with right triangles. Now, so far with a right triangle, all that you know is that you can use the Pythagorean theorem if you want to find the sides, right? Like you know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But these are going to be very useful whenever you have to talk about the angles of a right triangle, and once those are actually involved. So what we're going to do is first just set up sort of a picture. On a right triangle, it's actually really smart to label the opposite sides with angle measures. So in other words, if I'm calling the hypotenuse little c, I'm going to call this right angle big C. And if I'm calling this side little a, then the one that's opposite it is your capital A. And same thing here. If the bottom is little b, up in the top corner is going to be big B. So this is typically how we label a triangle, a right triangle. And what I want us to get used to is really focusing in on one of the angles and then talking about the relationships of the sides. So for instance, if you were asked to really pay attention to this angle down here, this angle A, then you need to be able to look at the picture and really label it in terms of how do these sides relate to that green angle, okay? Now C is always the hypotenuse, right? You should know that because it's the one across from the 90, but these two legs have a special name when you're looking at an angle. So if I'm focused over here, one of them is adjacent and one of them is opposite. Now adjacent just means next to, guys. So which one is next to this angle? Well, oops, not that. Okay, B is next to it. So I'm going to label this as the adjacent side, if I can spell it. Okay, and then if you have to go across the picture, that one is, we could say across, but usually in the math world we say opposite. Now, the reason this is important is because when we talk about these three buttons on the calculator, these are trig functions, and they're actually pronounced sine, cosine, and tangent, but what they do is they set up a relationship with the sides of the triangle. So in other words, when you see the word sine, the thing behind it is always an angle. So in this problem, which one have I highlighted? Well, I've highlighted A. So if I write the word sine, I'm going to write underneath that it's actually pronounced like that, sine. I would write sine of A, and then there's going to be a formula to go with it, okay? There's also going to be a formula to go with cosine. And the abbreviation is COS. Notice there's an angle behind it again, but it's pronounced cosine. And there'll be a formula for that. And then the last one we'll talk about this year is tangent. And of course, it just looks like the word tan, but it's tangent. Okay. Now, these formulas are just a way to set up the sides of the triangle as sort of a ratio to each other. So what I'm about to show you is an actual definition, okay? The sine is supposed to be the opposite over the hypotenuse. The cosine is supposed to be the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And these are like always the same. These formulas are always true. This doesn't change around on you. And then the tangent is always the opposite over the adjacent. So if you're looking at an angle and you've labeled these first, then you're just going to plug them straight up into those formulas. Now, before we do an example problem, I do want to make a note for memorization. A lot of teachers or your friends or upperclassmen have said the word SOHCAHTOA to you. And if you're like, what is this SOHCAHTOA thing? SOHCAHTOA is their memory trick to remember that the sine is O over H. See? Sine O over H. Cosine A over H. cosine A over H, and then the tangent is O over A. So all you have to remember is if you know how to say SOHCAHTOA and then spell it, is that you're going to have division signs in that problem. Now, some of my students who can't spell, like myself, prefer an acronym, and I do have one that could get me in trouble, but I'll tell you anyways. But when I was growing up, some people would say, to remember this, some old hippie caught another hippie tripping on acid. And so that's because I'm old, and that was back in the olden days. But this is how I used to remember SOHCAHTOA. Okay, so whatever you need to do. Now, if you know the formula, it's just going to be putting the information in the correct spot. So let me give you a random example so you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so here we have a random right triangle. Oh, that's terrible. Let's try that again. Okay, random right triangle. And let's say that I want to say A, B, C, and I want you to focus in on, maybe I've asked you to do the tangent of A, the sine of A, and the cosine of A. Okay, so if I've asked you to do all three of those, the first thing is to look here, because this is the most important thing. This is the angle you focus on. So in my picture, I'm going to focus right here. Now the reason, and in fact I recommend that you circle it or highlight it or something. The reason I'm going to focus there is because now I label the sides of my triangle, okay? And actually you needed to have more given, so let me pretend this was a 3, 4, 5 triangle. There we go. So sorry, those would have been given to you. But once you see your picture, you've got to label it up. So if I go across from A, this one's the opposite. Next to A, this one's the adjacent, and of course here is your hypotenuse, okay? So now that we've labeled them, if we remember our formulas, we just plug stuff in. So for tangent, I would have to remember, and I'll write it up here, SOHCAHTOA, some old hippie caught another hippie tripping on acid. Okay, tangent is back here at the back. So tangent is O over A. Well, in this problem, guys, which one's the O, which one's the A? Well, 3 is in the spot of the opposite, and 4 is in the spot of the adjacent, okay? That's what they stand for. So if you don't like just O and A, fill it in with opposite and adjacent. Okay, so that's going to be my answer. So if it's like, what's the tangent of A? This is my answer. It's 3 over 4. Okay, now what about the sine of A? Well, it's still on A, so now these are still labeled the same way. And for sine, I need O and H, and it's going to be O over H. So opposite over hypotenuse. So 3 over 5. And that's my final answer. And then what about cosine? Cosine is the A over H. Now which one's A? 4 over 5. Okay, so your answers just look like a bunch of fractions, and right now that means nothing to you, but I promise later it's going to actually be used to solve something. So one more example. I don't want to draw that. Let me switch this around a little. There we go. Okay, so maybe it's like C, A, B, C this way, and maybe you have like crazy letters or something, or I'll even, yeah, we'll do like maybe this is an X, maybe this is a 3y plus 7, and maybe that's like a 2r. Okay, so it doesn't matter what's here, guys. It could be numbers, it could be crazy letters and expressions. It's just about finding a relationship. So let's pretend that you're asked to do the cosine of B and then the sine of A. So two very different problems. Now, cosine of B, if I'm doing this problem, I'm going to come down here and focus my eyes here. And that's important because now I can label O, A, and H. So across from this is the O. Next to this is the A, and the hypotenuse is across from 90. So if they want me to do cosine, cosine is SOHCAHTOA, it's A over H. You can look back up at the top if you don't understand what I'm talking about. And A is all of that, so 3y plus 7 over what's in the spot of H? Well, it's an X. So there's my answer. So even though it's ugly and there's weird random stuff in the spots that you don't know why it's there or what it means, you can still set it up as this fraction, and that is your answer. So what about the sine of A? Okay, so now, since there's a different angle here, guys, we have to switch gears and go highlight a different angle. And now that this is the angle in question, these are no longer the O the H, and the A. Things switch around. So from this perspective, this one is now the opposite. This one is now the adjacent, and that does stay the hypotenuse. So sine is supposed to be, if you look up top, SOHCAHTOA, O over H. So the O in this one is 3y plus 7, and the hypotenuse is x. So don't be wigged out that these are the same answer, okay? It's okay because the angles change. So sometimes that happens, sometimes they're different, sometimes they're the same. Just really focus on the angle and where it's at. So hopefully that'll get you started with doing some trig ratios, sine, cosine, and tangent.